Good day, everyone. In the course of this presentation, I intend to introduce and elaborate on several ideas whose absence has caused significant harm, if not outright failure, in the formulation and execution of national security strategies within international relations. The omission of these foundational perspectives by mainly American and European security elites has played a central role in shaping the current challenges faced by the global community. It has led the world, and the West in particular, onto that dangerous path that they are steering right now. This set of perspectives I'm about to present will also propose an alternative direction, or rather, suggest a renewed focus for the development of future strategies and security frameworks. My name is Edwin Micewski. I'm a former military officer and an academically educated political philosopher. For more than 3 decades, I have focused through both teaching and publishing on the humanistic foundations of politics and the military profession, particularly in the fields of national security, civil military relations, military ethics, and international affairs. I have published widely in these areas, including on my blog, www.edwinseditorial.com. In my recent book, 44 and 45, a social philosophical treatise, available in both English and German, I examine the presidencies of Barack Obama and the first term of Donald Trump, exploring the central political and philosophical issues that arose during their tenures, including a chapter on the personal hermeneutics that underpins my analyses and an emphasis on foreign affairs policies, particularly outlining the genesis of the Ukraine debacle. You find respective links down below. The project I'm presenting here departs from the following judgments and key ideas. First, the end of the Cold War, more than 3 decades ago, presented the West with the rare opportunity to build a stable and inclusive global order. That opportunity, however, despite its promising beginnings in the early 1990s, was squandered. The attempted international order post the Cold War that was built on unilateral imperialist ambitions with the objective of establishing American and Euro-Atlantic hegemony behind the guise of liberal democracy is coming apart. Rather than embracing a collaborative and philosophically grounded approach to international relations, Western elites pushed for dominance. This pursuit has not only undermined the legitimacy of the existing order, but has also contributed to the fragmentation and erosion of international stability. Second, the blame for this failure falls mainly on the neglect to acknowledge a dimension too often absent from both political practice and its critique, namely the firm anchoring in philosophical theory. And this omission is not a trivial one, for the challenges confronting us today result not from crises of power, but at their core derive from a crisis of understanding. We live in a time of intellectual deficiency and confusion. Today, as a regretful result, we face new geopolitical rivalries, violent upheaval in the Middle East, civilizational tensions, cultural disintegration, institutional fatigue, and inconceivable just about a decade ago, full-scale warfare in the heart of Europe. Without a return to principled, philosophically anchored frameworks, the mistakes of the past will continue to haunt efforts to build a sustainable and equitable global order. The Ukraine-Russia war stands as a stark testament to the consequences of neglecting philosophical foundations in international strategy. This devastating conflict serves as a tragic illustration of what might have been avoided had the theoretical frameworks I'm going to discuss been considered at the outset. But instead, the war has now reached deep into its fourth year, and the loss of life on both sides, the waste of national treasure, and the scale of economic damage, especially for Europe, are immeasurable. Despite the various efforts made by Presidents Trump and Putin, efforts which have already been boycotted by certain leaders within the European Union and NATO, there appears to be no immediate resolution to the ongoing conflict. On the contrary, the bloodshed continues unabated and may well escalate even further in the near future. I personally have long appreciated the work of analysts who have not sold their souls to legacy media narratives and who continue to offer principled, independent assessments of national security, particularly as it concerns the Ukraine-Russia war. Among them are, to name the most prominent ones, Professor John Mersheimer, Colonel Douglas MacGregor, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davies, and Alexander Mercuris. Yet I feel compelled to contribute something that is often missing from both politics and its criticism, namely a grounding in philosophical theory. This is a complex topic that I aim to address thoroughly, so please, ladies and gentlemen, bear with me. If you find it valuable, please support by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. The aim of this presentation is to outline the key considerations related to this subject matter. The urgency arises from concerns that current approaches to resolving the Ukraine-Russia conflict and constructing an effective European and Euro-Atlantic security framework may be subject to significant missteps. Rather than pursuing comprehensive peace agreements, there appears to be a continuation of false pre-war assumptions and a trend toward increased militarization in Ukraine and across all of Europe. To navigate the complexities of contemporary international relations and security, we require more than tactical maneuvers. We need a profound theoretical foundation that can illuminate the principles and values necessary for sound decision-making. The absence of a solid philosophical foundation in international strategy has left Western institutions and political leaders without proper guidance, which is why these actors find themselves increasingly unable to comprehend or influence the complex realities of the contemporary world. This lack of philosophical anchoring has contributed to a sense of chaos and confusion that appears to intensify with each passing day. Yet, on the other hand, empirical and after-the-fact evidence can't save the day either. It is obvious that reliance on empirical evidence alone has proven insufficient. The tendency among political leaders to ignore the lessons of past outcomes and resist necessary changes in policy designs remains still widespread. A significant obstacle to reform lies in the prevalence of pride, ideological rigidity, and stubbornness, if not pig-headedness, among those in positions of power. These traits often overshadow any willingness to reassess and adjust strategies in the face of failure. This is particularly evident within the ranks of European leadership. where only few exceptions can be found, such as Viktor Orban, Giorgia Meloni, and Slovak Premier Robert Fico. The reluctance to implement meaningful course corrections perpetuates ineffective policies. Without a shift toward reflective learning and principled adaptation, the cycle of failed strategies is most likely to persist. The consequences of neglecting philosophical foundations in strategy are dire. Their omission in shaping strategic designs feeds our inability to construct a more equitable and sustainable world order. This shortcoming is especially evident in the persistent neglect of core concepts formulated in the 1990s, which were intended to interpret and help steer the international landscape in the wake of the Cold War. Before I turn to these theories, let me explain the foundation of my approach. Meaningful interpretation of facts and historical occurrences requires theories that are not merely derived inductively from empirical data. For both retrospective classification and future-oriented strategic design, we must ground our understanding in epistemologically rich and normatively sound theories that are valid before, on the one hand, and on the other hand, constitutive for all experience. In other words, and in philosophical parlance, they have to have transcendental character. The concept of the transcendental, as articulated in the tradition of Immanuel Kant and expanded in Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, describing the essential structures of consciousness as a correlation of the world's objects, refers to the foundational preconditions that enable human cognition and lend purpose to political action. These preconditions encompass core concepts such as freedom, dignity, duty, and justice, principles that are not merely extrapolated from empirical experience, but instead serve to structure it from the outset. Transcendental ideas and principles are accessible to reason alone, since they arise a priori as conditions of thought and do not depend on empirical experience. In this sense, transcendental principles establish, in a formal and normative manner, the essential conditions under which human action acquires meaning, direction, and moral responsibility. By doing so, they provide both orientation and legitimacy to practical endeavors and political undertakings. Crucially, these principles transcend considerations of mere utility. They endow human conduct and political practice with distinctly human quality, allowing for deliberation and judgment that aspire to more than just usefulness. They reach for the higher ideals fundamental to a just and moral order. When political action lacks a firm philosophical foundation, as it so often does, it risks devolving into the mere management of conflicting interests, a process marked by ongoing improvisation and cycles of trial and error. This absence of deeper guidance leads to repeated failures, echoing patterns that have recurred throughout history. Without transcendental principles to anchor decision-making, politics becomes reactionary rather than visionary, perpetuating instability and undermining the pursuit of a just and sustainable order. It is important to emphasize that the following ideas are not novel inventions, but rather critical elucidations that deserve enhanced recognition for their profound significance. In both international law and treaty making, we encounter normative transcendental principles that strive to transcend mere power politics and unilateral actions by dominant nations at the expense of others. A clear example of transcendental thought translated into a stipulation of international law is the principle of sovereign equality of all nations, regardless of their size, population, military, or economic might. This principle is enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 1 of the UN Charter and serves as a cornerstone for fair and just international relations. Another example is the principle of indivisible security, which forms an essential part of the European security architecture. Originating from the 1975 Helsinki Final Act and reaffirmed in the 1999 Istanbul Charter for European Security, this principle asserts that no nation should enhance its own security at the expense of others. These transcendental norms represent attempts to establish an order that is guided by principles transcending immediate interests and power imbalances, thereby aiming at providing a more stable and just framework for international relations. Transcendental thought in international relations acknowledges the necessity for norms that rise above the immediate empirical realities of state interactions and the power imbalances between them. These norms invoke the concept of a universal and higher moral order to which all states and actors are, at least in principle, subject. Such transcendental norms, however, even when translated into provisions of international law, often lack mechanisms of rigorous enforcement and depend largely on the willingness of states and their leaders to observe them. As a result, these principles are frequently ignored or even absent from the considerations of politicians, commentators, and media representatives. Nevertheless, the intent here is to delve further beneath the surface, to do justice to the theories and conceptual models that form the bedrock of these transcendental norms. By engaging with these deeper theoretical underpinnings, we can better understand both the promise and the limitations of normative principles in guiding international conduct and shaping a more just global order. Throughout history, eminent philosophers and thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Heidegger, and Ludwig von Mises have maintained that the fundamental structures of reality are accessible to human understanding. They argue that our actions, including those in the political sphere, must be anchored in these foundational truths. These thinkers offer theoretical frameworks that illuminate how political decisions can be interpreted, justified, and rendered meaningful. Their insights provide the groundwork for comprehending the principles that underpin just and sustainable political action. To underscore this perspective, I'm going to present several illustrative examples. Immanuel Kant, for instance, argued in his work Perpetual Peace that enduring peaceful coexistence is only possible if treaties do not include provisions that could lead to future conflict. The consequences of neglecting this principle are evident in history. For instance, had leaders like Clemenceau or Woodrow Wilson taken it to heart after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles might have been conceived differently. Rather than imposing harsh terms that fostered humiliation and resentment, a settlement grounded in mutual recognition and genuine stability could have prevented the rise of extremism and the eventual outbreak of another devastating war. And a similar dilemma confronts the world today. The importance of Kant's insight becomes clear when considering current efforts to resolve conflicts, such as the ongoing war in Ukraine. Durable peace can only be secured when arrangements are designed to be acceptable to all parties involved, avoiding conditions that might sow the seeds for renewed hostilities. This highlights an essential reality. Political decisions aspiring towards justice and durability must be anchored in principles that rise above immediate power struggles, dominance, or considerations of retribution. Or consider Plato's notion of the tripartite soul, a classic framework for both shaping character and structuring societies. This philosophical construct has profoundly influenced one of the central theoretical paradigms that shaped discourse following the end of the Cold War, and its significance will be explored in more detail in a little bit. Before turning to the major theoretical frameworks that shaped post Cold War international relations, it is important to briefly highlight the transcendental perspective offered by a more recent thinker, Martin Heidegger. Heidegger advocated for a return to foundational reflection on our own existence as a prerequisite for any genuine engagement with the world. His caution against becoming lost in the routines and mechanisms of modernity holds renewed importance in the context of today's technological advancements, including and particularly artificial intelligence and transhumanism. When Heidegger stated, "Only a God can save us," his intent was not to invoke religious doctrine as an exclusive solution, but rather to emphasize the existential need for deeper meaning, meaning that transcends mere technical or bureaucratic reasoning. This also underscores the importance of grounding political thought in an understanding of being, demonstrating once again that philosophical reflection should guide and impact strategic decision making. One further illustration of transcendental philosophical influence can be found in economics, notably in the work of Ludwig von Mises. In his seminal book, Human Action, published in 1949, Mises asserted that the defining feature of human activity, including economic behavior, is purposeful action motivated by individual expediency. He argued that decisions are shaped not by collective formulas or ideology, but by each person's unique understanding of purpose and meaning within their given situation. This was a radical departure from the classical economic focus on labor or production costs as exclusive determinants of value. Instead, Mises emphasized that value is subjective, arising from an individual satisfaction or utility. This perspective, rooted in transcendental philosophy, particularly in the tradition of Immanuel Kant, became the foundation for social and economic theory in the Austrian school. Alongside predecessors like Karl Menger and Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk, Mises's ideas became central to the Austrian School of Economics. Despite their rigorous attention to individual freedom and the coordination of markets, these theories have been largely sidelined, regretfully not only in their country of origin, in favor of still dominant Keynesian and neo-Marxist approaches. Nonetheless, Mises's influence now extends beyond Austria and beyond Europe. For example, in Argentina, President Javier Milei has pursued a reform agenda inspired by Austrian principles, demonstrating the ongoing practical significance of non-interventionist, freedom-based economic theory. This example underscores an essential point once again. Transcendental concepts are not isolated abstractions. Rather, they serve as foundational guides for real-world political and economic decision-making. With this philosophical foundation established, it is possible to examine the principal frameworks that came to define the discourse in international relations following the Cold War. In the 1990s, three distinct theoretical paradigms rose to prominence as attempts to interpret and shape the emerging world order. The three major theoretical contributions that stood out were Francis Fukuyama's concept of historical closure through liberal democracy, Samuel Huntington's civilizational theory of global conflict, and William Strauss and Neil Howe's cyclical model of a generational crisis. Each theory tried to explain the seismic shifts occurring in global affairs and recommended factors to be heeded in arranging international relations. Each framework offered orientation in a world no longer bipolar, no longer ideologically symmetric, and no longer governed by the strategic clarity of the Cold War. Each rested on its own set of historical assumptions, conceptual tools, and normative implications. One emphasized liberal democratic finality in the ideological evolution of humankind. Another foresaw enduring civilizational divides. The third outlined cyclical transformations of generational character and institutional legitimacy. Yet all were either misunderstood, ridiculed, or prematurely dismissed by Western security elites. Fukuyama's thesis was misrepresented as triumphalistic. Huntington's warning was dismissed as reactionary, and Strauss and Howe's generational model was almost entirely ignored. This neglect has contributed significantly to the intellectual blindness that now plagues Western security and foreign policy thinking. In The End of History and the Last Man, published in 1992, Fukuyama advanced the idea that liberal democracy and market capitalism, having triumphed over fascism and communism, represented the ultimate form of government. Yet the core of his thesis delved into a more profound territory, namely the human quest for recognition or thymos, the ancient Greek concept signifying the soul's longing for honor, dignity, and respect. Drawing on Plato and Hegel, Fukuyama posited that individuals and nations are motivated not only by material interests, but by the desire to be acknowledged and respected as morally and culturally worthy entities. This anthropological, indeed ontological, transcendental axiom of recognition that was largely ignored by critics is foundational to understanding global conflict. Russia's post-Cold War experience is a case in point and illustrates this claim vividly. Rather than integrating Russia into a balanced global security architecture, as was initially envisioned, with institutions like the North Atlantic Cooperation Council, later dubbed the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, the West treated Russia as a defeated power. It ignored Russia's cultural identity, civilizational depth, and strategic red lines. NATO expansion, support for color revolutions in Russia's neighborhood, and the refusal to grant symbolic recognition fostered a deep sense of humiliation. Russia's response, from rapprochement with China to the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine, must be understood not only as strategic maneuvers, but as demands for recognition and acknowledgement of its national interest. They were less an expression of autocratic arbitrariness than a quest for status and dignity within the international community. The West, however, in its self-assured hubris, neglected the cultural and psychological reality of other powers and failed to see that security is not and should not merely be a technocratic matter of control, power, and influence. It is also a question of mutual symbolic recognition and patterns of order. Transcendental theories help us grasp this dimension and elevate political discourse beyond power games and ideological fixations, which often obscure clear judgment. When we use these frameworks, we resist the temptation to reduce politics to expediency or tribal reaction. Instead, we begin to see the deeper structures at play, moral, cultural, and historical, and are thus better equipped to act with integrity and foresight. If applied, potential Russophobe impulses or anti-Russian sentiments would evaporate. Anti-Russian pathologies could not take root. The tragedy of recent decades, and especially the escalation in Ukraine, is in no small part the result of this theoretical vacuum. The neglect of the thymotic dimension as a condition for a legitimate international order. At this critical juncture, Fukuyama's theoretical framework is complemented by Samuel Huntington's influential thesis from The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, published in 1996. Huntington argued that in the aftermath of the Cold War, the most significant conflicts would no longer be driven primarily by ideology, but by cultural and civilizational differences. The West's belief that liberal democracy would become a universal norm overlooked the fact that Fukuyama's end of history was an ideational concept, not the encouragement to impose liberal democracy by force and military might. As long as other nations don't find it by their own evolutionary processes, cultural and religious identities of other civilizations will endure, particularly Orthodox Christian Russia, Confucian China, and the Islamic world. Western secularism, individualism, and universalist ambitions appear increasingly decadent and alien to many beyond the Western sphere. Huntington warned that the West would face resistance not because others lacked modernity, but because they wished to preserve their own identities. Russia's self-identification as a Christian Orthodox civilization, openly hostile to postmodern liberalism, can only be properly understood within this civilizational framework. Cultural and religious identity, not merely economic interests or strategic calculations, will define the geopolitical parameters of the 21st century. Huntington's insight was that attempts to elevate postmodern Western values, especially unconstrained individualism and secularism, to a global standard, are inherently flawed and are bound to meet resistance. Such efforts will provoke backlash from civilizations whose normative foundations differ fundamentally from the West's. The West's strategic attempts to export its principles through diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, military interventions, or instigated proxy wars like the one in Ukraine have not led to integration, but to rejection and counter-mobilization. The internal erosion of the West's own value structure, especially the abandonment of its classical Christian worldview, has deepened the divide. From the outside, Western democracies appear not as moral beacons, but as civilizations in decline, morally confused, socially fragmented, and spiritually adrift. The increasingly vehement secularization and the resulting socio-political transformations of Western democracies were seen by many states outside the orbit of the USA and the European Union as a decadent and self-destructive decline rather than as an ideal worth striving for. A perception that invites defiance rather than emulation. Under President Putin, Russia has repositioned itself as a classically oriented nation state, drawing on Orthodox Christian traditions and asserting its civilizational independence with its own historical development, cultural imprint, and nation state sovereignty. It rejects liberal internationalism not because it fails to understand it, but because it understands it all too well as a force that undermines its spiritual and national sovereignty. Russia's deliberate self-identification as a Christian Orthodox civilization, positioned in opposition to postmodern liberalism, must be interpreted within a distinctly civilizational context. In this light, understanding Putin, the Russian Federation, is a good and pertinent thing, not a bad and contemptible one as it has been cast in recent years by Western political elites and their connected media entities. By insinuating that understanding your adversary is bad, they try to suppress any factual objection to the one-sided approach they took to judge international relations and the ongoing war in Ukraine. They forgot that the statesman-like strategist has always distinguished himself from ordinary ideologues and low-ranking politicians by his ability to assess an opponent's political military capabilities and, more crucially even, their strategic concepts and security interests. The West's failure to acknowledge Russia's civilizational status and legitimate national interests has led to a rupture whose geopolitical consequences we are now witnessing and which are shaking the international system today. And this brings us to the third and perhaps most illuminating theoretical model to explain what's happening right now. A third and highly insightful framework for understanding current events is offered by Strauss and Howe's Fourth Turning, an American Prophecy, published in 1997. This model connects prevailing intellectual narratives with tangible developments in power and politics. While the theory originates from American history, it has increasing relevance for understanding global geopolitical dynamics given the widespread impact of U.S. policy in both national security and international affairs. Their thesis is that Western societies undergo a cyclical rhythm of institutional decay and renewal approximately every 80 to 100 years. Each cycle having four turns culminating in a transformative crisis, a fourth turning, a time in which the old order collapses and a new one is born. They predict that such a turning will begin in the mid-2000s. Neil Howe, the surviving co-author, wrote a sequel to the original book entitled The Fourth Turning is Here in 2023. In this follow-up, Howe argues that the crisis is indeed underway. It began with the 2008 financial crash, the rise of populism, collapsing trust in institutions, and mounting geopolitical tensions, all of which are symptoms of this generational upheaval. These disruptions are not anomalies, they are part of a broader generational reckoning and signs of a deeper systematic transformation. The current fourth turn will likely go on into the 2030s and eventually mark the end of an overstretched growth narrative. Increasing institutional erosion, polarization, economic instability, loss of trust in the media, academia, and electoral processes, and escalating geopolitical tensions from Ukraine to Asia are symptoms of this upheaval. Since the beginning of the fourth term, decisive proceedings have reflected the disintegration of the old order. Events such as Trump's election in 2016, Brexit, the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, the Black Lives Matter riots, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the erosion of supranational institutions like the EU or NATO are exponents of this cyclical shock. These developments embody the disintegration of an alleged postmodern consensus, and this fourth turning marks the return to questions of sovereignty, identity, national purpose, and strategic self assertion. Donald Trump's re-election in 2024, seen through this lens, is not an anomaly but a historical response and an expression of an ongoing cyclical moment by a generation expressing desire for strong leadership, seeking national renewal, and restoring cultural trust amid institutional collapse. Trump's foreign policy, frequently criticized as inconsistent and or unpredictable, can be understood as an embodiment of the cyclical imperatives described by Strauss and Howe. His rejection of multilateralism, his focus on sovereignty, and withdrawal from liberal global interventionism reflected not isolationism, but the end of an unsustainable globalist phase. His Monroe Doctrine style realism marked a reassertion of strategic restraint rooted in national interest rather than ideological dogma. The geopolitical implications are profound. Trump's pivot away from expansionism, the rise of populist movements, the weakening of supranational entities all signal a tectonic shift, are manifestations of a deeper change and signs of strategic realignment in international relations. The multipolar world order, the rise of China, the strategic solidarity of authoritarian states, but also the global resistance to Western universalism mirror the cyclical upheaval that Strauss and Howe described and corroborate their diagnosis of generational crisis and institutional reset. Whether Trump's agenda is the product of deliberate philosophical reflection or an intuitive response to historical necessity, I put aside at this point. But one thing is clear. America First represents a civilizational repositioning. It renounces globalist idealism in favor of realism, sovereignty, and cultural affirmation. Yet the transatlantic security establishment remains trapped in outdated paradigms, fixated on expansion, deterrence, and confrontation. The European Union's calls for massive military buildup on the implausible premise that Russia seeks continental conquest are emblematic of this outdated approach. Such a premise is not only fundamentally flawed, but borders on the absurd, revealing a significant disconnect from strategic realities. The widespread acceptance of this contrived threat scenario by most European member states and the enthusiasm with which political and media elites adhere to this fake threat model and propagate these narratives underscores a lack of deeper intellectual engagement of stakeholders in European security planning with the true dynamics of political affairs. This orientation is heavily influenced by a deep-seated and often irrational Russophobia, a posture rooted in inadequate historical, political, and cultural understanding, as well as a failure to comprehend the core of Russia's strategic thinking. They double down on unsuccessful assumptions and cling to an order that no longer exists, while ignoring the very theories that could help them understand why and illuminate the path ahead. Fukuyama taught us the centrality of recognition. Huntington exposed the reality of civilizational pluralism. Strauss and Howe charted the cyclical rhythm of renewal through crises. Together, these frameworks offer a foundation for rethinking international order, a way to reimagine a global order not as a universalist abstraction and flat liberal consensus, but as a dynamic interplay of sovereignty, identity, and historical transformation. By applying these frameworks, we move from mere reaction to genuine understanding, laying the groundwork for more thoughtful and principled policy decisions. A key strength of transcendental thinking is its ability to rise above the immediate, steering us clear of ideological bias and power struggles. The end of the Cold War offered the West a historic opportunity to create a stable, inclusive world order. That opportunity, as said in the beginning, was lost. Now, 3.5 decades later, we are living with the consequences. But we're also facing a second chance to make things right this time around. To restore peace, especially within Europe, and to re-establish the credibility of Western strategy, it is essential to abandon failed doctrines and draw upon the theoretical wisdom of earlier generations. This demands the adoption of a renewed idealistic realism, one that honors cultural sovereignty, acknowledges civilizational diversity, and responds to the timeless human need for recognition. The moment for genuine philosophical engagement in strategic thinking and statesmanship has arrived. I urge all who are responsible for shaping policy to meet this challenge with the seriousness it deserves. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. I will be back. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Take care, God bless, and I'll see you hopefully soon.